do you think?
Yeah, it's been difficult so far. The start was of course good, and I think the first 3 laps I just pushed a bit more compared to the guys ahead to try and have an opportunity, knowing that passing was tough. But after that, yeah, you just get into the same trouble. And of course, the more the tires wear, the more you feel those kind of issues. And that basically also then prevented us from really following them. I mean, I was basically just doing my own race out there. And that's, we need to work on that. Try and get rid of the bouncing, jumping, understeer in general in the long corners. That's still
It was tough out there, but it was good damage limitations. And then we will reset for the main point.
Yeah, the effect from yesterday is still there, so at least we know that. It's tough to look at by, feels bad to drive somehow.
Max Verstappen just suffered one of the most shocking performance drops of his entire Red Bull career, and the evidence from Qatar reveals a problem far bigger than anyone expected. The internal report confirms that despite an incredible launch from 6th to 4th in only a few seconds, Verstappen spent the rest of the sprint fighting a car that bounced, slid, and lost time in every critical phase of the lap. The hidden data exposes why the RB21 suddenly became unpredictable and how this disaster has tightened the championship to the point where even a single mistake on Sunday could cost Verstappen the title. Before we break down the full truth behind this drop in performance, make sure you subscribe right now because the championship fight has officially reached its breaking point. The Qatar sprint showed immediately that Verstappen's weekend was going to be defined by damage limitation rather than dominance. His launch from 6th to 4th was extraordinary, a moment of pure instinct in which he cleared Fernando Alonso and Yuki Tsunoda before reaching the first corner. That move saved his championship hopes, but the internal analysis confirms that the real story began the moment the field settled into race rhythm. From lap 2 onward, Verstappen's RB21 simply could not match the pace of the McLaren and Mercedes cars ahead. The leaders were running laps in the 1:24 range, while Verstappen slid out of DRS in barely 2 laps. The gap grew steadily as the car refused to hold a stable balance. Red Bull saw immediately that the sprint would be about surviving pressure from behind rather than fighting for the podium ahead. The technical data paints a worrying picture for Red Bull. Verstappen reported severe bouncing under braking and over curbs, not aerodynamic porpoising but mechanical instability. This violent movement disconnected him from the surface, making the RB21 unpredictable when approaching high-speed direction changes. The more he attacked, the more the car punished him. This forced him to drive below the limit, something Verstappen almost never does, and it confirmed that the setup direction was fundamentally broken. At the same time, Verstappen complained of massive understeer on entry that suddenly flipped into oversteer on exit. This transition forced him to slide the rear tires, which destroyed the soft compound on a circuit known for abrasive asphalt. The combination of bouncing, sliding, and inconsistent balance created a car that looked fast only in short bursts but collapsed over a full sprint distance. Red Bull suspected this might be linked to the aggressive front-end setup chosen for the weekend, a choice that the chassis simply could not support. The comparison with Tsunoda proved even more frustrating for the engineers. Tsunoda used a more conservative setup with a calmer rear end, which allowed him to perform strongly in qualifying. Verstappen managed to beat him only through racecraft and a perfect opening lap. The data revealed that the RB21 still had potential, but the configuration Verstappen carried into the sprint was fundamentally incompatible with the Lusail circuit. This placed the team in a position where talent alone could not compensate for the limitations of the car. The impact on the championship is now undeniable. Verstappen scored only 5 points for 4th place, while Oscar Piastri claimed 8 and Lando Norris added 6. That result widened the gap to 25 points behind Norris and left Verstappen only 3 points ahead of Piastri. The championship now stands on a razor's edge. One more poor result on Sunday and the title could slip out of his hands before reaching Abu Dhabi. Red Bull now faces the most important decision of their season. They can keep the broken setup and hope Verstappen survives the Grand Prix, or they can break park firm, start from the pit lane, and attempt a radical reset. The engineers know that without a miracle, Verstappen cannot match McLaren on pure pace. The only question is whether they risk everything now or try to drag the championship to a final showdown. Qatar has exposed the RB21, and Verstappen enters Sunday with the title hanging by a thread. The central problem for Max Verstappen in Qatar was that the RB21 never entered a stable performance window at any stage of the sprint. The car gave him just enough front-end support to attack the opening corners, but the balance collapsed as soon as the initial charge ended. The internal data shows that the setup Red Bull chose delivered sharp turn-in for the first sector, yet failed to provide the structural support needed for the medium and high-speed sequences that define Losail. Verstappen could gain at corner entry but immediately lost confidence mid-corner, which prevented him from committing to his usual aggressive rhythm. This instability became more serious once tire temperatures increased. The sprint format offers no time to cool the car or reset balance, and Verstappen's soft compound tires began to overheat far earlier than the team expected. The analysis reveals that the RB21 worked against him during these phases. The car bounced under braking, skipped over curbs, and punished him for every steering correction. As the tires became hotter, the bouncing grew stronger, creating a cycle that eroded the car's grip and left Verstappen unable to extract meaningful pace. A deeper structural issue emerged from the dramatic shift between understeer on entry and snap oversteer on exit. Verstappen described the car as sliding suddenly and unpredictably, forcing him to reduce throttle application earlier than usual. This meant the RB21 could not accelerate out of corners with the efficiency that normally defines Red Bull's strength. The internal timing data confirms that Verstappen lost small fractions of time on every lap, but the loss compounded rapidly because Losail rewards stable rhythm and consistent corner exit speed. The midfield pressure made the problem even more obvious. Instead of closing on the top three cars, Verstappen spent the majority of the sprint managing a shrinking gap to the group behind him. For the first time this season he drove a defensive race rather than an attacking one. Red Bull expected him to apply pressure on George Russell, but the RB21 lacked both the traction and the stability to challenge. Verstappen was forced to maintain a controlled pace to avoid destroying the tires entirely, which left him vulnerable to any driver with cleaner balance behind him. The contrast to the other Red Bull family cars deepened the concern. Yuki Tsunoda recorded stronger qualifying performance using a more conservative setup that sacrificed turn-in sharpness for rear-end stability. Verstappen, by contrast, carried a more aggressive configuration that magnified the RB21's weakest behaviors. The fact that Tsunoda felt more comfortable in a slower car highlighted the core issue. Verstappen's pace deficit did not come from lack of commitment or strategy, but from a setup direction that became incompatible with the circuit once tire wear and track evolution intensified. The championship implications formed another critical layer of the problem. Verstappen needed to reduce the gap to Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri, yet his fourth-place finish awarded only 5 points. In contrast, Piastri gained 8 and Norris secured 6. This outcome widened Norris's advantage to 25 points and placed Piastri only 3 points behind Verstappen. Red Bull understood immediately that the sprint result would shift the pressure dramatically onto Verstappen for Sunday's Grand Prix. The title fight that once seemed controlled now turned into a delicate balance of risk and survival. The final problem is the strategic uncertainty for Sunday. The RB21 in its current form appears unable to match McLaren or Mercedes across race distance. Red Bull now faces the question of whether to maintain a compromised setup or break park firm to rebuild the car from the ground up. One option keeps Verstappen on the grid but leaves him exposed to another performance collapse. The other option forces a pit lane start but may give him a car he can trust. Neither path offers comfort, and both reveal how serious the underlying issue has become. Verstappen enters the Grand Prix with a title on the line and a car that no longer behaves like the machine that carried him through earlier victories. Red Bull's engineering team entered the sprint under intense pressure because the RB21 had already shown signs of imbalance in the earlier sessions, and the sprint confirmed that the setup direction had moved the car outside its optimal operating range. The engineers designed the configuration to give Verstappen sharper rotation and stronger front-end authority, but the internal data reveals that the chassis could not support that level of aggression once the tires reached higher temperatures. This left the team with a car that looked competitive only on the opening lap and rapidly deteriorated once the sprint rhythm settled. The first major engineering concern came from the unexpected mechanical bouncing Verstappen experienced. The team initially believed the instability might be aerodynamic, but the analysis showed the movement originated from the suspension reacting poorly to curb compression. The vertical oscillation made the car unpredictable under braking, especially in the approach to Turn 1 and Turn 6. Because the sprint provides no chance to reset dampers or mechanical parameters, the engineers watched Verstappen fight a car they could not stabilize in real time. Every lap exposed a little more of the structural issue that simulations had failed to predict. A second pressure point appeared once Verstappen began to lose front-end efficiency. The RB21 is built around maintaining aerodynamic load through long radius corners, yet Verstappen reported severe understeer that suddenly flipped to snap oversteer on exit. Engineers traced this to an imbalance created by the aggressive front wing angle combined with a rear platform that stiffened too quickly as temperatures rose. The result was a car that stopped rotating cleanly at mid-corner and then unloaded abruptly as torque returned to the rear wheels. Once this behavior emerged, the engineering team knew Verstappen could not push without destroying the tires. The tire degradation problem became another major engineering challenge. Verstappen's tires overheated far earlier than expected because the constant sliding forced them outside their thermal window. Engineers saw the degradation curve steepen after only a handful of laps. The internal timing sheets show Verstappen losing small fractions of performance at each sector, magnifying his vulnerability as the sprint progressed. Once the tires crossed the critical thermal threshold, the RB21 lost traction and stability, making any attempt to chase the top three impossible. Engineers had to instruct Verstappen to manage rather than attack, a situation that goes against the philosophy of their car design. Communication with Verstappen added further pressure. The driver delivered clear descriptions of the car's instability, but the team was restricted by park-firm rules that prevented any changes. Verstappen reported bouncing and inconsistent grip phases, yet the engineers could only acknowledge the feedback without offering solutions. The pressure grew because Verstappen's observations confirmed what telemetry was already showing. The car was behaving outside its expected model, and the team had no corrective tools available during the sprint. Engineers had to focus solely on gathering information for Sunday rather than supporting Verstappen's push for positions. The comparison to Tsunoda's performance increased the urgency inside the engineering room. Tsunoda ran a more conservative setup that produced greater stability at the expense of initial aggression. His data showed more predictable tire behavior and a smoother load transfer through the medium speed sections. This contrast made it clear to Red Bull that Verstappen's chosen configuration amplified weaknesses that were concealed during simulation work. The engineers realized they had misjudged the balance between front-end sharpness and overall aerodynamic stability, turning Verstappen's RB21 into a car that was fast over a single corner but fragile across a race distance. The final and most difficult engineering pressure arrived once the sprint concluded. Red Bull now had to decide whether to maintain the compromised setup or break park firm for a complete rebuild. Keeping the current configuration risks another unstable performance during the Grand Prix, while a pit lane start sacrifices track position but may deliver a car Verstappen can trust. The engineers understand that the championship hinges on this decision. With Norris extending his lead in Piastri nearly level with Verstappen, the pressure to choose correctly has never been higher. The sprint revealed that the RB21 requires immediate structural adjustment, and the engineering team now carries the responsibility of protecting Verstappen's title hopes in a weekend that has already exposed their vulnerabilities.